Welcome back, everybody. So today we are going to be looking at the GDP report, and we're also going to be looking at other different types of macroeconomic indicators, what could be giving us a sign just in relation to where the economy, well, the US economy could be potentially heading. We are also going to be diving into the GDP report because I think it's massively important because there's so many people who are massively misinformed about this report, and they constantly read headlines. I mean, this is just a headline what I came across. The US second quarter GDP revised higher as businesses boost investment in AI, and this is a complete, well, in my opinion, this is complete nonsense. I mean, when you start to look at the report, when you start to dive into it, I don't really understand where they got this boost in investment, even though this is correct, right? I mean, obviously there is businesses in the economy who are investing in AI, but that is not every single business. And when you start to really dive into this report, you can basically see how you can manipulate this number to get it to whatever number you actually want. So Q2 of obviously 2025, this is April, May, and June, we saw a 3.3% increase in the GDP number. Well, this is all from the United States. And if you are unfamiliar what GDP actually is, let me break it down for you. So GDP is constructed using a variety of different types of things what are in the economy. So we add together the consumer goods, what is basically the consumption, the investment spending, government spending, exports and imports. So we take imports from exports, what gives us a net import and export value. We basically add all that together, what then gives us the GDP. Now, that might sound a little bit complicated, but I'm going to try and make this very, very simple for you to understand and how you can basically manipulate this GDP number. And the main thing you really want to be paying attention to is the consumer goods, the consumption, and the investment spending. And let me explain on where you can find that in this report. This report I'll put in the description box, so you can obviously go over this yourself. But yeah, I mean, if we just dive into this a little bit more, so it's basically saying that the second quarter primarily reflected a downturn in imports and acceleration in consumer spending, in consumer spending. Again, we're not even accelerating significantly, but the main areas are obviously imports and exports, and this is how you get to these large percentage changes. And obviously, the investment side is negative. And let me explain on how you get to this number. So if you go to page 6, again, just me personally, I do this every single quarter. So I go to page 6 and I look at line 32, and this is the final sales of private domestic purchases. And the reason why I look at this line item and the reason why it's very, very important is because it basically removes government spending, exports, and imports, and it looks at predominantly, in my opinion, the true economy, meaning the consumers in the economy, obviously businesses, etc. It removes the government numbers, and it also removes the export and import numbers. So in my opinion, it gives a very good understanding of where we currently are from a economy perspective. Now, there is probably going to be some comments who obviously say the accuracy of these numbers is not accurate, and to some extent I do agree with that. But again, you've got to start somewhere, right? You've got to look at some data to try and evaluate if the economy is going in the right direction or not. And I do think this line item is a very, very good indication whether we are in a thriving economy or we are in a declining economy, or let's say heading more towards a recession. Now, you can basically see when you look at different types of quarters, and you see obviously these growth rates of these different types of quarters. You can see that we had some quarters what were below 1, and this was in 2022. So this was Q3 and Q4, and this is when we had obviously quite a large correction in the S&P and NASDAQ. Now, where we're currently at today is about 1.9%. So I think that the economy is currently growing at 1.9% every single quarter. Now, another thing to pay attention to is just in relation to inflation. So obviously, if inflation is higher, or if you believe it is higher than 1.9%, then obviously we are going backwards, we're not necessarily growing. And something to pay attention to is something called a stall speed recession growth rate percentage. And this basically refers to a state of the economy. Growth rate has slowed to a pace that makes it vulnerable to a recession without necessarily being in a recession yet. There isn't a universal fixed percentage for a stall speed, but it varies depending on different types of economic models and everything else. But again, you want to be looking at, are we obviously going up or are we going down from a percentage change perspective, and also looking at things from an inflation perspective as well. There's something else what I just want to highlight, and that is just in relation to a K-shaped economy. And this is basically an economic pattern where different sectors, industries, and income groups recover at vastly different speeds, with some thriving and others significantly struggling, resembling the the diverting arms in the letter K. So obviously, as some groups go significantly up, and there's some groups who are going significantly down. And you can think about different types of sectors what are in the economy at the moment, or different businesses. I mean, obviously, the businesses what are thriving at the moment is anything in relation to AI, data centers, obviously software to a certain extent, and obviously the areas of the economy what are, not necessarily that favourable, or not necessarily the flavour of the month or the year is, let's say, commercial property, and anything in relation to retail. So these are just things to be aware of, and these are just obviously just different types of terminology. So you might hear this over the next couple of months, just a K-shaped economy, and obviously a stall speed just in relation to the economic growth rate of private businesses, basically. Now, if you wanted to get into the absolute weeds to try and really understand, okay, well, how are they manipulating this number, you can basically scroll down, I think it is page 8 or page 9. Yeah, so if you go to page 9, on line item 44 and 47, you basically see exports and imports. And on these line items, you basically see in Q1, obviously the US imported $309 billion of goods and services. And then on the Q2, we saw a significant reduction of about $338 billion. And even on the export side of things as well, we saw a reduction of $8.7 billion. Now, this is all in relation to tariffs. I mean, obviously everybody was stockpiling product before obviously the tariffs came in. And obviously as the tariffs obviously start to get implemented, obviously they are selling their inventory. And obviously you can see this as a reflection of these quarter prints. And this is how you basically manipulate these numbers. And again, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be this quarter, right? I mean, obviously we all know about the tariffs, the import and exports, how everybody basically overinvested or significantly invested. And that's another thing as well, just on the investment side. There is different types of line items for investment. So like gross private domestic investment, we saw that in Q1, we saw a significant investment from private businesses, obviously to kind of counteract these tariffs. And obviously in Q2, we've seen a significant reduction of about 14%. And you can start to dive into the actual numbers when you come down here. So yeah, $236 billion was invested in Q1. And then there was a large reduction of $166 billion in Q2 2025. Again, I mean, you can obviously go over these quarters on a quarterly basis. I mean, what I find very, very fascinating to do, by the way, is if you are a little bit geeky, you can go over these different types of quarters and just put into ChatGPT, why do we see these different types of declines? What could be the reasons for these declines? And most importantly as well, you want to be looking at what is being implemented on a policy level. So these are just obviously just showing you a snapshot of basically an income statement of the United States, or let's say a balance sheet as well. So you can be looking at the interest rates of the United States, and obviously the anticipation of interest rates can have large implications on investments. So again, looking at the private domestic investment line, what is obviously on page 6, line 7, you can start to look at how businesses are reacting to interest rate hikes. So as the interest rates started to go up, we saw that there was not many people who were doing many investments. So you can see as interest rates started to rise, different types of behaviour can change these numbers. On the disposable personal income, we start to see obviously people's income levels start to change because obviously businesses cannot necessarily afford different types of wages. Obviously, we saw a lot of wage compression from an AI perspective as well. And that's another thing as well, just on this line item 34 to pay attention to. It's just in relation to wage growth. So on certain quarters, obviously disposable income levels are rising 1%, 0.2%, 2.5%, 2.5%, 3%. Again, just going back to inflation. You want to be assessing, are we growing higher than inflation? Because if we're not, we're basically going backwards, and that is just something to consider. But yeah, the next time you see one of these GDP reports, I would encourage everybody to go to line item 32 on page 6, and I think this really shows a good reflection of the economy from consumers, private businesses, etc. Now, also what I want to talk about is just in relation to the economy. I know I've been quite vocal on DC Economics on Instagram, just in relation to the Fed, and I think there's a high probability that the Fed is not going to cut in September, and the reason for that is because of some of the numbers that are in the GDP report. I don't think things are looking really good, but I don't think things are looking really bad. I think there's arguments on both sides, and when you start to look at the money market funds, we currently have about $7.4 trillion sat in money market fund accounts. And that's basically cash sat on the sidelines, ready to buy the dip in the markets. From a delinquency perspective, this is people who are basically behind on their credit cards, commercial loans, etc. Things are starting to tick up ever so slightly. Now, when this page loads, you can see like things are obviously starting to tick up a little bit, and we are basically getting back to levels since 2011. And this is all in relation to interest rates. Obviously, interest rates being significantly high. Going back to the disposable income, obviously you need disposable income to basically pay down your credit card bills and everything else. I don't think things are looking really, really bad over here. And obviously, they are getting very steep. But I think there's a very good reason of why they are going to keep interest rates elevated is because the rest of the world want them interest rates to come down. And there's a lot of other things at play. And I don't really see them cutting interest rates just to save some businesses in the United States. I think it's a lot deeper than that. And this is something I've been talking about for the past couple of weeks and months, really, just in relation to what's going on in China, Asia, Europe, etc., and how there's a lot of countries who are more aligned with China than the United States. And obviously, you want to put a lot of stress on these economies, and you put the stress on these economies by basically keeping rates elevated. And I think that is all part of the plan. And I think you are going to have some domestic casualties, obviously, at home in the United States. That might be commercial banks, that might be some very large businesses. But I think the overall plan is to make these other countries quite weak and not necessarily as aligned with China. Now, I have got other videos basically explaining all of this. I'm not going to get into all this now, but there's different types of reasons of why you could kind of argue that the Fed is not necessarily going to cut unless something significantly breaks. And things are not necessarily significantly breaking. Things are starting to break slowly. Don't get me wrong, they are definitely starting to break slowly, but they are not broken yet. So I think you would only really step in with rate cuts or let's say aggressive rate cuts when something significantly breaks, because you have a lot of money on the sidelines, what is obviously willing to buy the dip. There's also something else what I found quite interesting, and this is in relation to household debt. And this is some macroeconomic data, household debt and credit report Q2 2025. And we see that we have a total housing debt of 13.35 trillion and non-household debt of 5 trillion. And this is obviously just all in relation to the amount of debt what a lot of people are significantly in. Now, you could do something what a lot of people are kind of suggesting, and this is all in relation to Ray Dalio's book called How Countries Go Broke. And this is called a deleveraging event, and how you can basically refinance and restructure a lot of the debts.